Good evening. For 20 years, beginning in the late 1960s, the infamous Black Mafia was involved in extortion, murder, drug trafficking, and embezzlement in the predominantly African-American sections of Philadelphia. The organized group, one of the bloodiest crime syndicates in modern U.S. history, collapsed in the late 1980s after several successful prosecutions and internal conflict. Who were Philadelphia's Black Mafia, and what can we learn from them about organized crime in general? We'll talk about that with Sean Patrick Griffin, a former Philadelphia police officer turned Penn State faculty member. His newest book, Black Brothers, Inc., The Violent Rise and Fall of Philadelphia's Black Mafia, has been optioned by a Hollywood production company to be made into a major motion picture. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I think it's safe to say that when most of us think mafia or organized crime, we don't think Black Mafia. And yet this was a group that made its mark for 20 years beginning in the 1960s, and you say was linked to some of the most heinous crimes in Philadelphia history. Who were they?
Well, Philadelphia's Black Mafia is a fascinating group. They began, by most accounts, in the early to mid-1960s. They formed around certain particular neighborhoods in Philadelphia. Most of them knew each other, either from childhood or mostly from youth gangs. Many of them had violent criminal backgrounds. In fact, all of them had criminal backgrounds. In the early years, meaning the mid-1960s, for the most part, we're talking in the dozens, they self-selected themselves by territory in the sense that people knew who they were. Their mainstay in the early to mid-1960s was extortion. What that meant literally was that they would go up to drug dealers and other illicit entrepreneurs like numbers runners, prostitution rings, and ask them for a street tax. And if people didn't pay, they would be harmed physically. And that's how they began. Nothing spectacular, and of course back then law enforcement for the most part treated organized crime as an Italian-specific phenomenon. So all throughout the 1960s, as the Black Mafia grew and grew, they were pretty much untouched by law enforcement. And sorry, go ahead.
No, but shelves are lined, bookshelves are lined with books on the Sicilian Mafia, the Russian Mafia, the Irish Mafia, but nothing until your book about the Black Mafia. How has it gone under the radar for so long?
Well, it has and it hasn't. My book is probably the most popular, but there have been very good books well before mine. One was a book called Black Mafia, ironically, that came out in 1972 by a famous anthropologist named Francis Ianni. And even before him, there had been much literature about what we would now call African-American organized crime, though at the time it wasn't designated as such. So when I first took on this topic 10 or so years ago, and I started looking into classic sociology, in fact, there was a wealth of literature on African-American organized crime. It's just that it had never been called African-American organized crime. It was called things like Negro Vice, or just classic historical studies of cities and urban centers that had large African-American populations. Well, in fact, when you look back at those times, there's an entire history of typical organized crime patterns, meaning voting blocks in exchange for any number of deals, just like you would see with other ethnic groups. So there is a literature. The problem is finding it. And the other thing is, and it's related to my project, one of the things that I found most problematic doing research on Philadelphia's Black Mafia was because there was nowhere to start, you had to spend a lot more time and energy than you would on most research projects. So for instance, if I was going to do a research project on the Bruno crime family, an Italian syndicate that lasted in Philadelphia for decades, that's pretty easy because law enforcement was tracking them. There are plenty of documents, there are news articles, and because of all that, there's academic literature based on all that. Well, when you were doing a topic as such a niche area, at least for now, as African-American organized crime, there was no baseline of knowledge. And that was the biggest problem. And so the issue for me as a researcher is African-American organized crime taking place, or has it taken place in other urban centers? And if so, how do you get access to data? And for the most part, data is non-existent. So if you were going to do this research in Detroit or in Atlanta or any other major metropolitan area, the problem is unless there's a starting point, either with a major organized crime case or with some other historian or journalist or whatever, it's not that it didn't exist, it's that the people weren't looking.